Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to be walking you through some possible solutions for a selection of questions in section 7-1. So let's get started. The first question we're going to go over is question 3 from section 7-1. And the question says, write a query to display the title, type, description, and artist from the DJs On Demand database. So this gives us some pretty basic information, and really what the query that we write isn't going to be super complicated. It's going to kind of be like the queries that we were writing in the beginning of this part of the course. So it tells us exactly what we need to know. We need to be displaying the title and the type and the description and the artist. And it tells us to use the DJs On Demand database. And so we know that we need to be using tables from that database, and we will be using two different tables. Okay, so to begin with, we will write our select statement, and that's where this information is going to come in. So we'll select the title, type code, description, and artist. Now you'll notice that I labeled with the dsongs.title, dsongs.typecode, dtypes.description, and dsongs.artist. Since we are using two different tables, we need to note which table this is coming from. So we need to know the title is coming from dsongs and the description is coming from dtypes, and so on. And then of course we're selecting from the dsongs and dtypes tables. And we also need a where statement. And in this case, our where statement is going to be where dsongs.typecode is equal to dtypes.code, because the code is going to be the same because we're using this code from the dtypes table. And we have to have that there so that all of our information is in the same row as the information that matches, so that we have a song with the same type code as the type and they overlap, right? Because that's information that pertains to both. So we'll go ahead and go into Apex and run our code. So I've got our code here in Apex, and we're going to go ahead and just run it. And what we get is we've got our title, our type code, our description, and our artist, and we can scroll through this. And if we wanted to know if this where statement worked, we could add in here a selector for dtypes code. And we can see that all of these codes match, and the information in the table matches that. Because, see, if we didn't have this where statement, if we check that out, what would happen is you'd run the code and you'd get the list of titles, type codes, and they would just be in whatever order they were in the when they were put in. So none of this information matches. So really, when you look at this, the song It's Finally Over has a type code of 12, but the one listed over here is type code 1 and it's listed as jazz. Type code 12 is pop. So the information, if you wanted to know what the type code or the type of the song was and what the type code and the artist was and everything of one song, you couldn't just do it without a where statement. So that's why we need that where statement. So this should be the code that runs, and this should be the output you get, even if you solved it a little bit differently. The last question we're going to go over is question 5, also from section 7-1. And the question reads, write a query that extracts information from 3 tables in the DJs On Demand database: the D clients table, the D events table, and the D job assignments table. So Just as always, we're going to look at this statement real fast. This tells us where to select the information from, and in this case, it's the dClients, dEvents table, and the dJob assignments table. And we know that this is from the DJ's on-demand database. Now, it doesn't tell us exactly which information to extract, so you could extract all of it. You could list out all of the rows, or you could just pick some information and compare it to make sure that your query is working the way it should. So for our select statement, I've used select c.lastname, c.firstname, c.clientnumber, e.id, e.name, e.event date, e.description, e.clientnumber, j.partner ID, j.event ID, j.job date. I didn't select everything, but I did select a good portion of it because then we can see the full picture. Because I'm going to assume that if somebody wanted to select a lot of information, it's because they want to see a lot of the important information about the events and the job assignments and everything all together. So I did select most of the information. And as always with this, you can choose a different identifier so that you don't have to write out dClients.lastname, dClients.firstname, and so on. And you can choose a different identifier like I did here with the C, the E, and the J. Or you can write it out with the table name without using a different identifier. I just did it this way for the shorthand so I didn't have to type as much. So obviously we're selecting from dClients, dEvents, and dJob assignments like it says up here. And then we'll have a where statement. And the where statement, again, is so that we can make sure that the information in the row is what matches along in all of the tables. So what we're using is the client number from the dClients table, and we need it to be equal to the client number listed in the dEvents table. But we also, since we have 3 tables, we also want the ID in the events table to be equal to the event ID in the job assignments table. So anything that doesn't have one of these isn't going to show up in the table if it doesn't meet one of these conditions. And we have everything that will show up in the same row as long as these match and these match. So we'll go ahead and go into Apex and run our code and see what happens. Okay, so I have our code here in Apex, and we'll go ahead and run it, and we'll look at what happens in the results pane. So as you can see, there is only one row that is outputted from this query, and we see that it's got the client number of 6133, and we can look up here, and the dClients table client number is the third thing, and that's what it is here. And in our where statement, we need that to equal the client number from the employees table, or the dEvents table, I'm sorry. And the dEvents client number is over here, and it's here, and it does match. And if we look at the dEvents ID and the dJob assignments event ID, we can see the ID is 105 over here, and the event ID from the job assignments table is 105. So it appears that our query is correct, and so if you solved this a little bit differently, this should be the output that you get. You should get information that has that matches in the row. If you get an output that has a different ID from event ID or a different client number from client number, then you need to double check your code. But this should be what you get when you run your code in Apex.